All right, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are, good time of the day, I guess. Today's session is going to be a little bit different. I've invited Derek Wallbank to join us and to do a presentation on geopolitical risk, as you can see from what is being shared right now. Many of you actually know Derek. Derek is a proud 2022 graduate from the iMBA program. He is a senior editor at Bloomberg News. And about 8 years ago, he was one of the first people, the first person to report the opening shots of the US-China trade war, publishing the initial headline that marked a big shift in the American trade policy. Since then, he's published or edited more than 1,700 stories, as actually almost 1,800 stories related to tariffs, trade, and sanctions. At this time, he is based in San Francisco. He still works for Bloomberg News. He steers US government and economics coverage in West Coast and East Asia hours. And he, as I mentioned, he is a proud graduate from the iMBA program. He took a few classes from me, and I hope that he didn't totally hate him. And with that in mind, Derek, it's all yours. We'll try to have that more as a conversation following the presentation. I'll do my best to answer questions in the chat or to voice them out. But if there is something you'd like to ask, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Derek, all yours.
Thanks, Vlad. I had a great time in Vlad's class. I took not only macroeconomics with him and Professor Hadi, but I also took statistics with him and Professor Fatna, and have used both of those. Used them very quickly on, and this is a fun sort of conversation here for me. Geopolitical risk is kind of my favorite thing. It's my kind of sweet spot, and the thing that I kind of try and bring to the table. So let me give you a little bit about me. Um, as Vlad said, I'm a senior editor covering the U.S. government and economy. I steer our coverage on the West Coast hours and into East Asia time. My background is both in Asia and in Washington. I ran breaking news for most of Asia for Bloomberg. Before that, I ran our Washington breaking news desk, and I kind of come up through Congress, White House coverage, things of that nature. Um, I wanted to sort of start with a kind of why we do what we do. I think it's a helpful grounding to the conversation. And I wanted to give you an idea when we at Bloomberg are talking about news and events, kind of where we talk about here. So what I brought up for you is a simple central bank decision. It was a surprise central bank decision. From the Singapore Central Bank. They operate in a slightly different way than most other central banks do. They sort of steer their monetary policy through maintaining a currency band, and so by changing the slope, width, and center of the currency band, they either tighten or loosen their monetary policy. This was a surprise change. It was a 5 minute win for Bloomberg against our competitors. You can see in this the movement of the Singapore dollar. This is based against the U.S. dollar, and there's a simple concept that I like to call information arbitrage, which is basically that you know something before somebody else knows it. You have the ability to buy, sell, hold based on that information. For our clients, a story like this, a move like this allows them to execute moves on the Singapore dollar before other people see it. That was the case here. It was, I think, for a lot of people, quite a profitable trade on that day. And if you're sort of in the business that we're in, that kind of information arbitrage is a real key as to why somebody's willing to pay for a Bloomberg terminal and why they need the news function that Bloomberg Terminal or something that any of our competitors like Reuters with their icon or similar might provide. Let me go over real quickly what I mean when I say geopolitical risk. When I'm talking about this, the Federal Reserve defines this as risk associated with wars, terrorist acts, tensions between states that affect the normal and peaceful course of international relations. What I would define is maybe even more broadly, geopolitical risk is quite simply the risk that you have against the sort of global political and policy macro sort of situation. This can be everything from elections, and I have somebody who really likes my industry, who is in Congress, and then they retire, and now I've got a problem, all the way up to major things like the COVID-19 pandemic. Geopolitical risk is really broad, but it's a really critical risk profile that companies are having to deal with. And it is an increasing concern that a lot of companies have to deal with, and a lot of that they may not have paid as much attention to before, that they certainly are paying more and more attention to now, especially after like the last 5 or so years. One of the things that I'm going to be sort of highlighting through here in these uh, the charts that I have up here is something that BlackRock puts up. This is their geopolitical kind of risk assessments. They do it every single year. So these risk assessments that you'll see in these charts that you may see are BlackRock's risk assessment as of December of 2025. You may notice some things in there that you disagree with. You may notice some things in there that after this last week feel out of date. All of that's fine. This stuff can move very, very quickly, as we all know. But just to give you a grounding, that's what this is. This chart here is one of my favorite starting charts. It is a sort of graph of the attention that people are paying to something, as opposed to the relative movement that it could have in a stock market. With like one big event going on. You can see at the bottom, there's a big there's a big sort of gap in the amount of market attention that's being maybe paid to different things, even if a company like BlackRock thinks that they have equivalent amounts of geopolitical risk, even on potential high likelihood events. So I think that that's a really interesting thing. And as you're sort of thinking through this topic, be aware that the amount of perceived attention to something and the amount of actual potential risk are not always the same. There can be divergences in there, and that can be either something that people try and exploit for gain or profit, or it can also be something that people need to watch out for because maybe they're not paying attention to something that they need to pay attention to. Two thoughts coming off of that. Um, there, overall, I think you can kind of break geopolitical risk into two into two kind of categories. One of them is what I might call a baseline risk. It's kind of a foundational thing that undergirds everything that's going on. U.S.-China tensions is one that I think is a really great example of this, right? The two world's largest economies, so many supply chains pass through one or both of these. It's very hard to think of a lot of supply chains that don't touch either of these, either directly or in a competitive fashion. And if the US and China are getting along, everything sort of in the world economy seems like it's going in a better direction. When they're in conflict, we wind up having some major problems. Uh, then there's something else called a conditional risk. Conditional risk is something that's like you have a decision, or somebody has a decision over whether or not they're going to take an action, and they do it or they don't, right? So rather than it being always a thing, it's something that might be more of a thing at some point and might be less of a thing at another point. Um, so trade protection would be a great example of this. You can see in the charts here where the U.S.-China tensions chart is really kind of more constant. It's just sort of, it is a kind of baseline that everyone has to deal with. The trade protectionism really rises and falls, and you can kind of see that there is some, if you overlaid those date ranges versus the U.S. electoral calendar, you would see that, when you have President Trump in office, who has made uh, trade such a big part of his foreign policy portfolio, there is a perceived greater risk than when you have somebody like President Biden in here who really was not trying to initiate a lot of new things. It was a much it's not that he changed the policy he inherited so much, he really didn't too much. But what he did was he kind of kept it at a more level thing, whereas President Trump uses uncertainty as a negotiating tool. And so you can see the sort of risk movements based on that. So that's kind of what conditional risk means. Now, this is one of my favorite charts, and this is a first big interactive moment here. But I'd love to see a guess from anybody. This is the stock price of a U.S. listed firm that I would say is incredibly heavily exposed to domestic geopolitical risk. You can look at the moves. You can look at the dates that I've put at the bottom. I don't know. I don't know. I would say like 2 points to anyone who can guess the industry. And if you guess the firm, I'll give you 10 points. I'll be so impressed. But what do you think the industry is? What do you think the firm is?
James, go ahead.
Uh, can I give two guesses?
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. One guess is potentially retail and Walmart. Um,
Why would you think that?
well, one possible reason is because geopolitical risk. Um, Walmart depends heavily upon manufacturers of inexpensive goods, and additionally, they have a very strong connect to the plastic industries, which are connected to China. So, um, thinking about kind of maybe the nebulous between U.S. and China, that might be one possibility. And then
Okay.
a second guess would be an energy firm of some sort, but I don't know which one it would be.
Okay. All right.
We
Other
also,
guesses. I saw Vic mentioned NVIDIA in the chat. What are other guesses anyone has?
and Derek, in case none of those guesses are correct, could you just at least tell us the industry first, and then maybe open for another round of guessing?
I'm happy to tell you the industries. Anyone else want to take a guess at the industry first? No?
J-
Everyone go at once. Come on. Hey, some brave soul. I
I'll
already told you
here's
what it is.
I was gonna
Mike,
take a
go
stab.
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna take a stab. I'm thinking maybe airline industry, just because I see this sort of COVID dip and then a bit of a recovery. So, but then there's this big jump when Trump wins the election and takes office. So, it might not be. But that jump stands out to me. The 2024 November-ish spike jump there. So maybe oil. I'm guessing maybe.
Okay. Mike, you're going down the right pathway. You've identified in the chart one of the key deliverables here. This is a very U.S. political linked firm in terms of its own geopolitical risk. Claire, my daughter, who's here, is guessing tourism. She, but yeah, you're in the right space, because what you're seeing over here a bit higher, right here in the Trump administration. You're seeing right here. This would be about November. This is election day, and look at that rise after Trump's first election. And then let's go over here. This is about November again. Look at that rise following the second election. So, yeah, it's really key to people thinking that the president was going to be helpful for them. And then look at this giant fall overall. Really, from you come down here and it's just right at the bottom. It doesn't really move too much when Biden's around.
So that's a firm
So there's
that's
a
potentially a bit allergic to the Democratic administration's policies, right?
exactly so. So so here I see a couple of other guesses in the energy oil space. Um, the industry is private prisons, and the company is Geo Group. It's a major private prison company, and so if you're looking at building detention facilities, if you're looking at building, they operate prisons as well, but it's publicly traded. And so there's two of them that are publicly traded, that are large and publicly traded. Geo Group is one of them. But so this is it. The down line on the left side was actually an announcement from President Obama that he wanted to get private prisons more out of the federal uh, landscape. And then you can see the immediate reversal from saying, oh, this is a risk to our business. Oh, Trump unwinds that risk entirely. And even if you're looking at something versus an expected gain, you can see in both cases there's an expected valuation after that hasn't really been realized in both cases. And investors kind of come down on it over the next year. But even so, even when you get that, you're finding a company that's trading at 3 times now what it was at the low points under Biden. And sort of if I drew a hypothetical midpoint through this somewhere, you're still saying a company that's trading twice what it was pre-Biden, and you can see all of this stuff right here as you come into the election season, and people start saying, okay, who do I think is going to win? Is it going to be Trump or Biden? Or then you get to, is it going to be Trump or Harris in that campaign, and et cetera. You can see people trying this volatility here as people try and figure out where that line is going to be. So I like to use that as a great example of how geopolitical risk can really affect a firm and affect investors' view. Here's another one that I really love, and this is Tesla. Right, it's a big company here. I was just in Fremont this morning. Drove by their big factory that's on that side of the East Bay, and you can see something here that I want to point out. This is a deliberate um, snapshot of time, right? The U.S. election is over here on the left side, right? And we all know that Elon Musk was very close into Donald Trump. He was his number one benefactor politically in the campaign. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent. And then, of course, Musk took over this idea of Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, trying to cut the size and scope of government. So you have all of this buildup here as you have an investor assessment that this is going to be super, super market positive for Elon Musk's companies. And then you get somewhat of a backlash to some of those, right? A lot of people who were first adopters of electric vehicles might be on the left a little bit more politically here in the United States. And so then you get this idea of, oh, we don't like what that's going and we don't like those things, and that falls down. And so you can see a kind of relationship that there is an expectation and there's maybe sort of a backlash. And that's one of the points that I want to make here is that the geopolitical risk really does kind of cut both ways. You can have a positive risk and you also can have a negative risk at the same time, right? I put some questions in here. Let's say that you're thinking about Elon Musk's companies, right? And Tesla is one of them, but SpaceX would be another one. You can think of some of the things that he's put out, Starlink and some other things. You can think of some of the solar stuff that he's doing. You can think of potential upsides there, right? But there are also some potential downside risks. And I think that keeping those in mind are important. Here's some coverage that we can see here. Um, particularly in California, particularly in Europe, you could see that electric vehicle sales increased in 2025, but that Tesla sales decreased among that same population. And so even as people were choosing more EVs, they were deliberately not choosing Teslas. We're out here in San Francisco, the city of is a place that voted 80% plus for Kamala Harris. Just north of that, in Marin County, you're talking about 90% of the vote for Harris. So very, very heavily Democratic areas here. And you got some people who are sitting there putting bumper stickers on their cars saying that I bought this Tesla before everything I didn't know, trying to insulate them. Also, on the flip side of that, yeah. Um, and on the flip side of that, you do see a lot of positives, right? I'm putting one of my stories up here, which is a little bit cheeky, but that's okay. It's my presentation. I can do that. But you see, President Trump bought his own Tesla. He stood rock behind Elon Musk on this. Conservative influencers went and bought Teslas to do that. And you can see in other parts of the world where there was, people trying to figure out how to get into Trump's orbit. One of the ways is they could say, okay, well, is there a way that I can connect into Elon Musk's orbit, right? And you saw you saw some countries actually making deals to bring Starlink in, uh, partially because they wanted to do it, but partially because that would be a way to signal to the president that they were on side and they were trying to play ball. So let me pause there for a quick question. Do I have any questions that people have at this point in the presentation? We're about halfway done. Oh, well, more than halfway done.
So I'm seeing just a question from Vivian. Vivian, do you want to voice it out?
Hey, thank you. So I always wonder how a firm can quantify political risk. The reason I ask is a lot of investors would like to know how they could be compensated by the amount of risk that they take. So the quantification of any risk will be very meaningful, fully important.
I think this is one of those, you can take it into the MBA class on process management, and we had an equation in there that's very similar to this. It is the what would happen if, and sort of say like what would the quantify the risk as much as you can, and then what is the chance of it happening, and multiply.
So at your firm, is there a particular way or a particular formula that you guys use?
That would be it's a back of napkin, but that's the way that I would do it. Yeah. Is to say what's the chance of the risk happening, and then what's the impact, either favorably or adverse, of the risk happening. And you see this playing out in prediction markets now, in your poly markets and your Cauchys and things like that, where people are where those markets are putting a price on something specific. I tend to think that those markets, while being somewhat illiquid, are also a lot of times get the risk wrong. And were it not for severe conflict of interest rules that we have, I feel like I could become an instant millionaire playing those prediction markets and just the things that I feel confident in. But they try and put a price on it, right? And so you could go out and get a price right now on, Gavin Newsom being the Democratic nominee in 2028. But you can also bet on some of these, real risk indicators that could have big, potential movements for oil. One of the things that we talk about here is what is priced into the market. And so sometimes you can see, sometimes there's quite sophisticated ways to say whether or not you think that a Fed rate decision is all the way priced in, or if it's not all the way priced in, right? Like you can do that through futures contracts. And so if you sort of think that the price of oil is going to go up, like just hypothetically, let's say that the price of oil is $100 a barrel. It's not, but let's say that it is, for easy math. Let's say that you think the price of oil is going to go up, but your futures contract right now shows it at 98 for 6 months from now. There are ways to, you can just bet the opposite of that and you'll be fine. Or if you think that it's going to go, down to 95, but the futures, contracts at 98, you can bet that a different way, right? And you can kind of go through there. So futures wind up being, futures and options wind up being ways that you can express some of those bets. And in Singapore, which I know you're very familiar with that market as well, Viv. But we would find people playing FX that way, on the corner stores, to try and figure things out. If they thought the Sing dollar was going to do really, really well, they might get as much of that. But if they thought that the Sing dollar was going to go down, you might see people going out and buying a bunch of yen, or whatever else it might be. So let me pop back in here real quick, and I want to show you something. This is, Vlad alluded to it, but this is right here the start of the U.S.-China trade war. It was January 22, 2018, and me and a colleague of mine, Sarah McGregor, were online, and these two headlines up here were the very first headlines that started that sort of marked the start of the U.S.-China trade war. And I want to show you something here, which would be something that when I'm talking with university classes a lot in the undergrads, something that I sort of feel like in that moment I probably didn't get all the way right, which was that when you look at our story, what's the headline? The headline is that Trump pulled his punches in the first foray into long pledged tariffs. There was a real market reaction that Donald Trump didn't go as far as he could have gone. Now, obviously, after having gone through 2025, we see what sort of the difference is. But the very first tariff headline in the start of the trade war was about washing machines. And the point here is that really big things can often start quite small. And so you see a lot of, grade in or grade out. And this idea of geopolitical risk, it doesn't hit necessarily all at once. So let's talk into the risk a little bit here. And I want to I'm going to go over some of this really quickly, and we can kind of come back to it later if you're really interested into it. One of the things I would note is that it's hard to measure risk. You were asking, Viv, about quantifying it. I would say it's hard to even measure it sometimes. And the worse something gets, the harder that it is. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of people doing now is really thinking a lot more about alternative indicators, right, to tell us what's going on. A great example of here in COVID, I sort of apologize for the morbidity here, but if you have a public health crisis, you have government data on what's happening. And even if it's well-meaning and people are trying to get everything right, sometimes it's hard in a moment of crisis, right, to get all of that stuff right because you have other priorities. But you can see other things. If you have a public health crisis and everyone's saying, oh, it's not so bad, but you see that the morgues are over capacity and that there's refrigerator trucks lined up outside because the morgue can't process all the bodies, you know what's going on, right? A second thing that I would say that I want to sort of go over here is that the risk environment here has a real effect on prices. I think in the first macro course that a lot of people take, one of the first things that you learn is about price and how, we got supply and demand and price and an equilibrium and all of that stuff. One of the things that you find is that the more that the risk increases, maybe the less that price is the thing that you're actually trying to get. The example I give here is in Singapore, where I lived for the last 6 years. And during COVID, we had some issues with food supply chain. Singapore can't feed itself. It has to import food. Early on in the pandemic, there was a point where we were worried we couldn't get eggs. And then a little bit later on, Malaysia cut off its exports of live chickens. And chicken rice made from live chickens is Singapore's national dish. All of a sudden, 99% of your live chicken imports are coming in from a place that wasn't sending them in anymore. So Singapore pivoted a little bit and said, you know what, cost isn't going to be our number one thing. We want supply stability. And so that has reoriented trade flows. And you're seeing now Singapore being much more willing to import fruit, vegetables, etc., from places like Poland, where they previously would just get them from Asia. They're willing to pay more because they want to make sure that they're never going to run out again. Seeing this now, thinking through the context of tariffs, on a full country basis, right? Canada, and I want to sort of show this out here. The top thing is a graph of where Canadians actually live, right? It's not equally spread out. About 2/3 of Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the United States border, and Canadian trade in most cases is oriented in a north-south direction, right? It's easier to get from Toronto to Detroit or New York than it is to get from Toronto to Vancouver. Okay, easier and cheaper, he says. That's bolstered by the idea that the U.S.-Canada border is the world's longest fully peaceful border. There's a free trade agreement that's in force, heavy cultural ties, all of these things. You think that trade should be easy, but right now, given the givens, given the tariff threats that have been issued over the last year, Canada's looking east-west for a lot of things, and they're changing the way that they're operating. Now, Vlad asked me a question when we were going through this, and it was about tariffs, and he was noting that a lot of economists would think that economics broadly and economists broadly got some of the tariff stuff wrong, that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. And in thinking about why that might be, I come back to Jurassic Park. I hope everybody likes Jurassic Park, because I certainly do. There's a really great thing that Jeff Goldblum's character says in there, which is simply, life finds a way. If I were presenting this in Hong Kong, I'd note Bruce Lee and his quote that says, be water, right? Because trade overall is very liquid. It flows in the path of least resistance. You try and find markets, and if something doesn't work, you try and find another direction. So one of the things that I want to bring to you is this idea that at maximal levels of geopolitical risk, I already said geopolitical risk at maximal levels makes your indicators harder to see. Another thing that it does is it has a sort of neutralizing effect at the far margins. Why is this? Because nobody wants everything to go completely to biscuits, right? At certain points, things get so kind of hectic that people are like, hold on, we need to stabilize, right? And so you have a lot of stabilizing factors that might mess up the curves that you think are going to happen in certain ways. So if your thesis is that tariffs are going to completely upend the world economy and it's going to make everything terrible forever, you have to counter with the idea that a whole bunch of institutions are incentivized at their core to minimize disruption. Now, the flip end of that is that minimizing disruption, if you are the Fed and you go into easing, if you are a Congress and you say, hold on, let's ease fiscal policy, departments, let's have subsidies and farm rescues to farmers who are impacted. All of that also effectively subsidizes risk. So that's a really interesting kind of conundrum that you get to. So here's some key takeaways that I have here. In sum, geopolitical risk cannot be overlooked in macroeconomic assessment. I think it's important, but I hope that you think it's important as well. Baseline risks are things that are always. Conditional risks can go up and down. Risk is hard to measure, but it gets harder to measure the more risk that you have. Actors who are incentivized, as I just mentioned, to minimize impact may inadvertently subsidize risk. Price prioritization changes the more risk that you have around. And while I would say that tariffs had a substantial impact in 2025, including the starting of reordering trade flows that we will see the effects of for years to come, there is a silver lining to that maximal risk, which is, as Jeff Goldblum says, life finds a way. I have a whole bunch of references here at the back that I'll put up here so that your screen captures can get them. Vlad put a lot of these into the LinkedIn post, so I hope you've been able to see that as well. And we've got a bunch of things there. I'm obviously easy to find on LinkedIn, so I'm more than happy to uh, connect there if we're not already connected and talk through this further. But I'm really looking forward to any questions and some more of the conversation that we're having here.
All right, folks, please feel free. Unmute yourself, ask questions. I'm hoping we'll have more of a discussion here. James, go ahead.
Okay, so first off, this is a very interesting presentation. I come from a previously defense background, now an entrepreneur, and so I'm familiar with geopolitical, in the defense perspective. And connecting it to macroeconomics is just really fascinating to me. And I'm curious, is there a framework you use that links geopol to macroeconomics that you can speak of, or is it has it been kind of intuitively developed by yourself, or how do you do that? I'm curious.
Walk me through what you're thinking here, because I would say there's a lot of different ways, and it's sort of a network thing. But can you walk me a little bit further down the path on your question?
Sure. So I know geopol is kind of nebular. So, for instance, let's say something to the effect of like increased defense spending, like significantly increased defense spending by country X, who is
Yeah.
a kind of a frenemy of country Y. And how then do you walk through like recognizing, okay, now they've got this policy where they feel like they need to increase their presence on the border or the overall defense spending, and how that walks into macroeconomics.
I gotcha. Yeah. So if you sort of, it's funny because I sort of ask myself some questions and then I answer the questions, if it were. It's not so much that I have a formula, but it's sort of a call and response kind of thing. So let me take the idea of defense spending overall. Right. Trump wants increased European defense spending, right? So European defense spending had been low. A lot of NATO countries, particularly on the western side of NATO, had not made their 2% of GDP defense allocations that they're meant to do. And Trump said that that's non-negotiable. That has to be the case. So if you're going through that sort of thing, the sort of call and response that I give is this: do you have a country that's able to spend indefinitely? If not, then you're dealing in a world of finite choices. So at that point, if you're going to increase your defense spending, let's say from 1% to 2%, I'm just going for rough numbers. Let's say you're going from 1% to 2%. You have two options there. You have to raise revenue or you have to cut your spending on something else, assuming that you need to balance your budget every single year. And so if you're raising taxes, then you are taking money a little bit out of the economy to do that sort of reordering where it goes and where it flows. But you could also otherwise sort of trim spending and try and move those cost allocations. Let's say that the government's paying for something, and instead you want the private sector to pick it up, or you say maybe this can this is something that we can do without. And then you say, all right, well, what is it that you think the easiest thing is to do in response to this? And then what is your citizenry going to allow you to do? Because anytime that you sit there and you say, okay, I have an increased allocation over here for whatever I quote unquote need to do, and in a lot of cases that need to do is one of those things that feels like politically taking medicine. If that's paying bondholders in some places, if that's defense spending on things that are only going to get blown up like missiles and such like that, especially if that's buying from somebody else because you don't make it yourself, and that's taking money out of your economy. Sometimes those can be quite politically unpopular, and you're trying to find where that balance is and where those things can go. And so I kind of, as that risk network kind of webs out, kind of like a spider's web, it's doing so on these in responses to just those questions of, okay, if this, then what? If this, then what? And I like to ask myself a lot of if then questions, and then kind of build what that web looks like in response to those if then questions.
That's great. It seems like you start with the kind of deductive reasoning kind of premise and take careful steps, asking questions along the way to then see like where different macroeconomic variables are impacted and what frameworks can be applied to those specific.
Exactly. And James, as a news editor, what I would say is that every single one of those questions is a story, right? So if we're sitting there and we're having a conversation about, okay, what are these governments going to do? Are you going to tax more? Are you going to spend more? That's a question you can immediately go to the lawmakers and say, well, what are you going to do about this? And then when you get hard choices, well, that's going to have an effect on your bonds, which is going to have an effect on your currencies. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to, are you going to open the spigot and potentially lower your currency, or are you going to, you know what I mean? Like you can go down those things, and every single one of those is a reporting opportunity. It's an opportunity for scoops. It's an opportunity for market moving journalism, which is obviously a lot of what we do here. So when we're going down that way, we sort of take it as opportunities to say, okay, um, what do we think could happen, and then what are these question points? Let's go report that out. And then we find that markets move and those open new questions, and it's just, I mean, you know, there's an infinite number of questions that we find ourselves asking right now.
Yeah, it seems very academically and curiosity rewarding what you do. I'm very very intrigued. Thanks for sharing this the thought processes. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And so one
Michelle, I love your question that's in the chat of the examples of alternative data. Um, can we dig into that a little bit? I think it's a
Sure.
great question.
Yeah, please.
Vlad, you put a response in there. Can you sort of share through that, and I'll
So
think of some other
sort of
things.
I gave a short example that I've been reading about more recently, right? And so for example, sort of if you look at the major United States cities, and if you look at the data that is being reported by the commercial buildings about their occupancy, so a lot of them are showing significant decreases in their occupancy, or significant increases in their occupancy rather. But those decreases are not all that big, right? Sort of, for example, maybe sort of before the start of before 2020, you would be reporting a vacancy rate of 2 to 5%, and now you might be reporting a vacancy rate of 5% or 10% or 15% or something like that. In San Francisco real estate markets, sort of we've seen vacancy rates of 30%, maybe a little bit more downtown. And Vivian, correct me if I'm wrong. You probably know this better than I do, right? But very often when you look at those numbers, sort of you could take those reports a little bit skeptically, because there is a bit of an incentive for those commercial building owners to inflate their rates up, right? Because it helps them in their negotiations, it helps them to attract clients better, and so on and so forth. And so one of the alternative indicators of something like that is the use of electricity, because that data could be pulled. And if you're looking at some of the major markets that are claiming, oh, our vacancy rate, say, is about 15% right now, right? It increased from 5% to 10% over the last 6 years. And at the very same time, you look at their electricity usage, and that electricity usage in many cases went down by more than 40%. And sort of that gives you a significant pause in terms of evaluating those claims. And you're starting to say, well, yeah, sort of, but there should be something else going on, right? And that's something else going on. It could be, all right, so many of our employees are working from home, which is probably not very good news in the long term for those commercial building owners, because it means at the next cycle of renewal, a lot of companies are going to be cutting down their real estate space, right? If the people are working at home, might not as well pay for the extra space that you need. But that also gives you a sense that there is a lot of ghost occupancy that is being reported, right? I mean, companies might have a contract. They might not be actively paying for the contract. They might be in the process of trying to renegotiate that contract significantly. And so those sorts of alternative indicators can give you a very good sense of where this particular market is going. And so again, I'm not quite prepared to discuss at what I've been looking at recently, right? But of course, my sense is that in many, many major cities, both on the East Coast and the West Coast, there is still going to be significant shrinkage of that office space. There is going to be significant conversions taking space. And potentially, sort of there might be some crisis brewing in at least a few of the cities based on this data and the alternative indicator of the electricity use.
Yeah, Vlad, I would jump in on this. Many of you have seen this photo. This is one of my favorite of what you were saying. Of if you were just simply asking yourself who's doing better, North Korea or South Korea. This is a website called 38 North. It tracks Korean relations and things of that nature. But this is a very frequently cited image. This one's like it, which is just simply the Korean Peninsula at night, right? You can see South Korea. Here's Seoul, right? Here's Pyongyang, and here's North Korea. And then here's China, right? Here's Dalian down here, right? And you can sort of see China's very vibrant and active at night. You can see bright lights around the population centers. This is even right on the Korean border. This is a town that has some economic links into North Korea. But across North Korea, you can see the outline of it, right? Right there. And it's an obvious difference between them and the other places. And so when you're having these, sort of things, I could tell you that I think that South Korea since the end of the Korean War has done economically a lot better than North Korea has. Or I could show you a photo of the both countries at night, and it's very obvious looking at electricity uses that South Korea has a more vibrant economy than North Korea does.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. What a great example.
Yeah, but these sorts of things I really like, and I think that it's important as you're sort of going through these. If you're thinking about risk, again, it's that sort of if then question that can take you down the right area there and allow you to spot early trends, right? If I were an investor in let's say using um, restaurants as an example, and I were thinking, and that was what my job was. One of the things I might think is when I go out to eat, are restaurants busy or are they not busy? Can I get a table or can I not get a table? And that might be the start question that I might have going into other things. And all of these wind up being indicators, right? If there's if you're trying to see people come into work and saying, what's our downtown commercial real estate market going to look like here in San Francisco, which it is very much heating up because of all of the spend that's going on AI right now. I would be thinking to myself, okay, what are my municipal transport or municipal transit revenues looking like? What are the ferries coming in from Larkspur and Vallejo? What is the BART revenue, our subway system here? Is that going up or down? When I look around parking garages here, are they charging more or are they charging less? Are they discounting or are they not feeling the need to discount? When I look at the little bodegas that you get in the bottom of some of the really big buildings here, what's the price of a bagel, right? Is the price of a bagel lower or are they raising it because they can go, do that? What are the lines look like? None of that is official government data necessarily. I guess the transit rates are, but a lot of that, those aren't intended to be telling me about commercial real estate, that every one of those things in tandem, as well as the electricity usage that Vlad mentioned, are keys that help me understand that, and help me understand kind of the world in which we live and what the sort of outflows are. And they're also, if I have one of those geopolitical risk scenarios, there are also ways of measuring some of those things and some of the outflows that you might get. Yeah, Vivian, I like your comment on foreign relation policies are a huge part of risk premium too. Absolutely, absolutely there. And those are heavy like reordering things. And I mentioned the Canadian example. I was talking with a Canadian High Commissioner in Singapore, um, for an event at the Singapore Press Club was holding, and he was talking about the North South and the East West. And Asia is a real market that Canada's trying to explore more. They had a big Canada's big on wine, particularly white wines and sweet wines and things like that, up in Niagara and out in British Columbia. Um, and they sent winemakers to Hong Kong and to Singapore and such to try and get them distribution deals so that they could go over there, stuff that would have come into the United States instead. On the flip side of that, if you are Jim Beam, if anyone's a fan of whiskey here, you'll have seen that Jim Beam has idled production at least one facility in the United States for a year because they can't sell as much. Part of that is because Canadians are just not buying the whiskey that they used to from the United States because they just don't want to do it anymore. So you really do get that sort of reordering on the foreign relations policies. I mentioned the Singapore trade as well, but you can find in some markets that it really kind of stops on a dime. China is a great example of that, where you can see the geopolitical risk there. The U.S. around the time of the Iraq War, people will recall, um, uh, people of a certain age will recall that there was a real backlash against French products because the French weren't backing the U.S. up in that conflict so much that in the United States House of Representatives cafeteria, they changed the name of French fries to Freedom Fries for a while. Um, but you can see those sorts of things go downstream all of the time, right? You can also see it on the other side. And that's one of the things that I think it's really, geopolitical risk is easy to see on the downside, but you can see it on the upside as well. Right. So if you're a company like Five Guys, right, really sees a huge benefit to labeling where its potatoes were. You walk into any Five Guys and they'll tell you where their potatoes are from, right, that they're making the French fries out of, because there's a certain um, feeling that you get about knowing where your stuff comes from and seeing, oh, my potatoes are from Idaho and Idaho makes really good potatoes, and things like that. So you can see kind of some of that elevation on the positive side, because as I said earlier on, the risk is not just downside. I think people think of risk and it's all downside. It really is on the upside as well. And so sometimes it's like, man, I really like this. I want to be more involved in that area, and that's really really a huge thing, and it's something that we see all of the time, both at a country level and then also at an individual corporate level.
I just want to also very quickly pivot back to the discussion of tariffs. Derek talked a little bit about the question about what is happening to tariffs and why tariffs, what seems to be like a relatively significant increase in tariffs in the United States doesn't seem to have impacted economic growth very much, right? So one of the articles that I shared in the comments to the post in the Macroeconomics Hours group on LinkedIn, that there was a Wall Street Journal article recently, I think from the last week or so, that talked about some of the recent research in macroeconomics. And a lot of those research is kind of like a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. And if you go to some of those original studies, you can see that. So I found those studies that they didn't name and I put them in the comments in the post as well. But couple of things that we are seeing is that some folks from San Francisco Fed and some folks from Northwestern University looked at the historic economic performance after tariffs were introduced, and they went way back. In one case, they went back to 1870 and then back to 1840, right? So if you're going more than 150 years back in history to evaluate the impact of those tariffs. And so a couple of empirical results of their studies is that when you introduce tariffs, they typically raise unemployment and reduce economic activity, and that serves as a potential check on the ability of tariffs to cause inflation, right? Because if you're basically cooling down the economy a little bit and take the pressure of prices, that means that inflation is not going to be as high as it could possibly have been, right? And so in a lot of those historical studies, basically you're seeing a significant negative impact on economic growth and employment in year one. And when I say significant, obviously we were talking about statistical significance. It might be a drop of something like 0.6%, which, sort of in any economy is also very practically significant too, right? And so you're seeing that negative impact relatively high during the first year. After 4 years or 5 years, all of that kind of comes back to zero, especially as situation changes. And so those two studies provide an interesting explanation as to why we haven't seen that adjustment in prices yet. However, keep in mind that inflation still is stubbornly high, right? It's certainly above the 2% target rate in the United States, and it actually inched up a little bit closer to 3%. So we are not doing all that wonderful on inflation still. It sort of seems high compared to the 9% inflation we had in some of the post-COVID quarters. But also keep in mind that there have been a lot of intertemporal shifts in the behavior by companies and individuals. And these, sort of, for example, during the first quarter of 2025, when companies started expecting the tariffs to come online, they accelerated their imports very, very significantly. In fact, they accelerated them so significantly that we had a negative economic growth in the first quarter of 2025. I think the latest estimate of that was negative 0.5%. And pretty much all of that was due to the significant increase in imports. And what you have is companies sitting on significant inventory. And so during the first couple of quarters of 2025, or quarters 2 and 3 of 2025, rather, we are still seeing companies selling off significant chunks of those inventories. And because holding inventory also costs you money, they're not increasing the prices on them as much as they can. For large companies, and Derek and I talked briefly about that, there is also significant political pressure not to increase their prices, right? And companies will generally do that to avoid upsetting the current administration, but you can only do that for this long because you're forced to actually increase them, right? And yet another explanation in there is that, the headline tariffs could be really, really high. You're seeing we're applying tariffs of 50% on that, 100% on that. However, effective tariff rates have not increased as much as the headline numbers suggest, because most of the imports, I think at least about 50%, maybe a little bit more than 50% potentially, is still not subject to tariffs, right? And sort of those exceptions and loopholes are helping to keep down that inflation. But there's, of course, significant amount of risk there that those loopholes could also be taken away at any time. And if that takes place, then we certainly could expect inflation to increase a bit more. So I think it's probably a little bit too early to say that, economists have got a black eye because they haven't been able to explain this very well with their traditional theories. There is a lot of theories that still explain why, sort of why that pressure on prices has not been as high as it possibly could have been. Heidi, any other thoughts on the tariffs issue and the relatively muted response of prices to tariffs. And Heidi, you're on mute if you're talking.
Well said. You have mentioned quite a few of the factors. I just want to add that if you had paid attention to the elasticity of supply and demand, we might have been able to predict this. The substitution of inputs or goods basically for each other, buying from China versus buying from Vietnam. All these possibilities for substitution actually reduce the impact of tariffs, and that should have been expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Heidi. And sort of, and this is kind of like a nice way to potentially finish this session. So a lot of our discussion had been about the extremely humble response of the markets to events like this, right? And sort of this is the beauty of the markets and why economists like them so much. If we had any other different system of distribution, if we had something like central planning like we had in the former Soviet Union, and sort of I think I mentioned that before one time or two, but the typical joke in the Soviet Union was that the most destructive force of the Soviet Union was not its army. It was the central planning committee filled by the economists and bureaucrats, right? And of course, when we say economists in the Soviet Union, these were not your typical economists, but rather planner economists with very different take on things. So any other distribution system would probably not be able to respond as beautifully as the millions and millions of private producers and consumers brought together by the markets. And sort of that is something that I am certainly happy about, right? That is one of the blessings the markets give us.
Exactly. The elasticity of supply and demand plays such a central role in determining the impact of tariffs or other policies. Sanctions, for example. You look at sanctions, if you sanction a country which has alternatives, has elastic supply, elastic demand, prices don't change that much, quantities don't change that much because they substitute for the item that becomes more expensive or unavailable.
Yeah, and we certainly have seen that with China, right? Sort of we're seeing less trade with the United States, but we're seeing a significant increase in regional trade with other countries.
Exactly.
And that means that, sort of if you look at the imports as percentage of GDP for China, they really haven't moved very much, if at all.
And their exports also.
Yeah, exports and imports, absolutely, yes.
Right.
All right, folks. So we are a little bit past 2 o'clock. So any last minute question? Anything else that Derek or Hadi or myself can answer for you?
Thank you. This is awesome. Thank you for all your help and have been doing this for us all year round.
Well, today the thanks really go to Derek. So thank you, Derek, for being our guest today. It's hugely appreciated. We hope that we can have you back soon. And folks, if there is any other thoughts about future topics, let us know. We'll be putting together the calendar for, sort of for the next year relatively soon, and we'll go from there.
Thank you all for coming on and listening through there and your great questions and feedbacks in there. As I say, this is a topic that I spend pretty much every day thinking about. So I'm more than happy to connect. If you want to go on LinkedIn, as I say, I'm easy to find. Happy to talk more there. I would also put in a plug for if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area or will be in March. Our big get together in the North Bay is going to be here at the Bloomberg West Coast offices in San Francisco at beautiful Pier 3. So we'd love to have you and see you in person if you're going to be in the Bay Area around March. You can contact Vivian, who leads the Bay Area group of Gies alums, and we'd be happy to have you involved and have you come over and see this gorgeous office in person.
I like that plug-in. Thank you so much. And thanks, heads off to your daughter for sitting through all this. I can't believe it. Good job.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank
Much
you. Thank you.
appreciated,
Thank you.
and talk to you soon. Happy New Year.